Your microphone is on, Joan. All right, well, we'll let the last few people trickle in while I'm doing my introduction. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sophie Lavoie, and I'm the organizer of these feminist lunch talks that are 2 talks that have happened this fall, and then more talks that'll be happening in the winter term, so keep posted for those. We just want to be acknowledged that we're on the unceded territory of the Holistic Way people, and we're thankful for them welcoming us on their territory. I'm really happy to be hosting you today with this talk by Heather Millar on fracking uncertainty, the politics of risk in Canadian provincial public fracturing regulation. And so it's going to be an exciting talk. We haven't heard a lot about fracking. Well, we've heard off and on about fracking in the last couple of years, but not a lot since the moratorium. So it's going to be exciting to hear about that. For those of you who don't know Heather, because she's just recently hired at UNB, Heather is a political scientist specializing in Canadian public policy, and her research interests, as her talk proves, include provincial energy and climate politics, policy learning and feedback, social acceptance of new technologies, and things like that. She has a PhD in political science and an MA in public policy, and tangentially a BA in English and Women's Studies, which is the link we have here. And she's working actually on a book project that's related to this talk, so maybe she'll be able to tell us a little bit more about that when we get to the discussion part of the talk. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather in just a second. I just wanted to ask you to please save your questions for the end or type them into the chat if you'd like, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. Heather's going to talk for about a half an hour, and then we'll turn it over to the members of the public. If you have any questions for Heather, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer them, and we will go from there. So welcome, Heather, and over to you.
Thanks so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and many thanks to UNB Gender and Women's Studies and the Women's Center and the Office of the Arts for hosting me today. I'm really excited to share some of my research. I just want to check in that you can see that all okay, because I can no longer see you.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, great. So as Dr. Lavoie mentioned, this work draws on my dissertation research, and it's in the process of being a book, developing it into a book manuscript. I've just recently come out with a publication and review of policy research that draws on some of this, which I would be happy to share, and also have a book chapter and an edited volume that's coming out on provincial policy learning and transfer. But one of the reasons why I was really excited to present to this audience and as a part of the Feminist Lunch series is part of what I'm working through for the book is exploring some of the implications that my work and my analysis might have of using a sort of a gendered and intersectional lens. And so really any feedback that you might provide at this point will be from your sort of area of expertise, will also be very helpful for me moving forward. So I'd like to begin today with a thought experiment. What I'd like you to do is to imagine that you're a government official tasked with developing regulations for a rapidly emerging policy area. Scientific information is uncertain, with evidence pointing to different risks every day. Public attitudes are running hot, with protests sprouting daily up across the province. Your actions will have significant economic ramifications. So to whom should you turn to for advice? What knowledge and values should you take into account? And what regulatory actions should you take? Now, it's possible that some of you might have been imagining public health policymaking in a global pandemic. But these dynamics also describe hydraulic fracturing regulation. So hydraulic fracturing is a relatively new practice of oil and gas extraction in Canada, but public opposition to the practice has erupted across the country over the last 10 years, from the St. Lawrence Valley in Quebec to the streets of Halifax to the traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq and the Wet'suwet'en. So in this context, Canadian provincial governments have responded in different ways. Some governments have made small changes to their existing frameworks for oil and gas. Some have developed completely new comprehensive regulatory frameworks, and others have restricted the practice by implementing moratoria or bans. And so what my research looks at is why these provincial governments have developed these different regulatory frameworks, and probably more importantly for our discussion today, how has policy change occurred in each province? So today what I'm going to do is just provide you a little bit more detail about hydraulic fracturing and how it's fostered what industry calls a shale gas revolution, and why that might matter even in the context of declining oil and gas prices for COVID, due to COVID and other factors. And then I'm going to go through the analytical framework that I develop in the book. And what I argue in the book, just to give you a preview, is that although structural factors explain broad differences between Western and Atlantic provinces, what's really important for understanding how policymaking occurs is to look at collectively held ideas about risk. And then to illustrate that framework, I'm going to take you through two different processes of regulatory development, focusing on New Brunswick, and then I'll talk a little bit about how similar dynamics unfolded in Nova Scotia. And then I'll conclude my talk with some of my thoughts about the theoretical and empirical contributions of the work, and some emerging thoughts that I have about the interplay of gender, risk, and power in Canadian policymaking. So to give you a little bit of background for those of you who aren't familiar with the practice, what hydraulic fracturing or fracking is an extraction technique that's used in the oil and gas industry. And so what producers do is they force high volumes of water down a well that is vertically and then horizontally drilled. And what that does is it creates fractures in the rock, releasing natural gas and liquids. And what this has done is made it possible to extract natural gas and liquid petroleum liquids from types of resources that previously you could not access using conventional drilling techniques. And one of the resources that has been the most prolific in being developed is shale. So that's why sometimes people call natural gas shale gas. So oil and gas production from shale has really fundamentally transformed global energy politics. And so this is a graph from the US Energy Information Administration. And basically what these graphs show is that the US natural gas production pivoted in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, everyone thought that natural gas you'd hit peak production and that it was going into steep decline. And instead, you see this massive boom that really leads to unprecedented high levels of production in 2019. And this had a significant impact on global markets for natural gas. What it did is it increased supply and it created volatility in prices, and for both gas and liquefied natural gas, which is how you can transport natural gas over long distances. And these dynamics are changing during 2020 because of COVID and the oil price war earlier in the year. However, recent projections still suggest that there is going to be consistent production from shale gas out to 2040. What this happens has the effect that this has had in the Canadian context is that it's basically reversed North American trade flows. We used to export primarily to the US, and now the US is beginning to export to us. In the short term, the U.S. production in 2020 has declined by about 50%. But again, there's an anticipation that this will bounce back as vaccines are developed. And so we're still kind of looking at a long-term production. Natural gas is kind of here to stay. It hasn't been hit as hard as oil and coal. And this has implications for global GHG emissions. So natural gas is less carbon intensive than coal, which has led some proponents to argue that natural gas can be seen as a transition fuel. And you can see this this is two projections from the International Energy Association's 2020 World Outlook. So the blue here is the stated policy scenarios, which are what governments have currently committed to. And you can see that even though there's a significant reduction in coal and oil, that you still see a bump in production of natural gas. So basically what they're anticipating is that natural gas will replace that. That gets in the sustainable development scenario, which is more aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway. Natural gas is phased out by 2030. But again, the variability and the political feasibility of those two scenarios is going to have significant repercussions for what we're going to see with regards to natural gas. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So in Canada, exploration and production of shale gas has been primarily focused in BC and Alberta, but as you can see from this map of shale plays, there are actually resources across the country, some in Manitoba, some in Quebec, and then some in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and New Brunswick. And so provincial variation has also varied across both time and space, and this is what this is looking at. It sort of separates regulation into 4 different categories and then across time. So you can see that there is a clustering of the Western provinces, right? The British Columbia and Saskatchewan have developed single issue regulations, while Quebec and the Atlantic provinces have implemented moratoria and bans. However, or moratoria and more comprehensive frameworks, but there is differences within regions. So Alberta has a more comprehensive framework than its neighbors, and Nova Scotia's ban is more stringent than New Brunswick or Newfoundland. And so my book examines these empirical puzzles, exploring how provincial governments have developed these different regulatory frameworks. Okay, so why do we see this variation? Well, an intuitive explanation would be to turn to the material interests and structural factors and the effect of industry on regulatory outcomes. And this is analysis of regulatory development in the US with US state governments has argued and found that corporate power is a prime determinant of regulatory design. So regulators in energy dominant states tend to develop more limited environmental protections. In Canada, this energy dominance helps explain British Columbia's single issue regulatory regime, but it doesn't help explain why Alberta has a more comprehensive framework, or really why Nova Scotia, with its strong connections to offshore oil and gas, implemented a ban on the practice. US research also finds that environmental mobilization can play a mediating role, and environmental advocates have argued that fracking can lead to a variety of, can have a variety of negative impacts on the ecology, including groundwater contamination, earthquakes, land use impacts, habitat destruction, degraded air quality, and poor health outcomes. And in some jurisdictions, a history of environmental mobilization has also led helps explain sort of more precautionary or stringent regulatory frameworks that with more stronger environmental protections. But not always. In British Columbia, we have there is a strong network of environmental mobilization, but they weren't able to get a strong movement going, or weren't able, that the movement in BC did not translate into stronger regulatory frameworks. But by contrast, even though there is more limited history of environmental organizing sort of through professional organizations in New Brunswick, you still see some really active organizing, anti-fracking organizing in the province. And finally, there is some research that suggests that political ideology can play a role, with right-leaning governments more likely to be pro-resource development. But in Canada, some right-leaning governments have also implemented comprehensive frameworks, and governments from a range of political parties have implemented moratoria. And so what I do in the book is I argue that these discrepancies are better understood when we focus on the process through which structural conditions and contentious politics shape regulatory design. And what I argue in the book is that regulators' attention to ecological harms is mediated through the social construction of risk. So what am I talking about? Well, a substantial body of literature in cognitive psychology suggests that our risk perceptions are shaped by two key dimensions: unknown risk and dread risk. And I'll define these for you. So unknown risks refer to hazards which are unobservable, unknown, and new. The degree to which we perceive of risks as unknown is influenced by our perceptions of scientific uncertainty, and in particular, how scientific information gets framed in public debate. Dread risks, however, refer to hazards which have impacts which are considered to be involuntary, catastrophic, and inequitable. So dread risks can drive issue salience, increasing public attention and political urgency. At the individual level, risk perception often has a gendered and racialized dimension, with women and people of color more likely to rate risks higher along dread or uncertain dimensions than white men. Although the significant or the extent of that difference really is quite sensitive to issue area. So public opinion scholars are still trying to unpack how risk perception works at the individual level for public opinion. The analytical contribution of my book is to argue that the framing of unknown and dread risks also operate at the policy subsystem level through collectively held beliefs about risk or narratives that we have about risk, which I call risk narratives. And so what I do in the book is build on policy scholarship. There's a area of policy scholarship that looks at policy images, which are narratives about environmental hazards that draw on combinations of dread and unknown risks. And so what I argue is that risk narratives influence where regulatory formulation happens within government and who participates in the process. And it's sort of, so it tends to guide whose knowledge gets involved in policy making. So just to give you a little bit of sense in a more concrete way of what I'm talking about, in the book what I do is I trace out 4 ideal types. So the first kind is a linear risk narrative. And in this, dread risks are framed as minimal and unknown risks are low. And so what these narratives do is they reinforce the presumption that risk can be managed within government by government bureaucrats within existing line departments. And so what it does is it positions government analysts and technicians as the dominant actors. Under these conditions, regulatory frameworks are likely to be developed through processes of technical learning, focused really just on the specifics of policy instruments and settings. And from a gendered perspective, linear risk narratives in effect tend to reinforce the status quo with regard to regulatory science. And just to give you an example of a linear risk narrative, this is from a BC government official. I'm pretty comfortable with the maturity we've had in this field. I've seen nothing to date that would tell me we're not out on front on all the environmental issues. So this is really reinforcing the idea that government can can contain the risk. It's fine. In complex risk narratives, unknown risks are framed as high. Dread risk is still low. But what these narratives do is legitimize policymakers to turn specifically to scientific expertise to develop regulatory design. But it's a specific set of experts. So in fracking, it's hydrologists, geologists, or economists. And this privileges the role of that kind of expertise in the regulatory process, which can be called a kind of epistemic learning. And so in the context of fracking, this complex risk narrative, what it does is it privileges the input of primarily industry expertise into the policymaking system. And here's an example of a complex risk narrative. We owe it to our province's economic future to have an open mind, to let science do its work, to assess both the risks and the economic potential. Okay, moving into, though, these sort of two alternative kinds of risk narratives, you can have an uncertain risk narrative in which unknown and dread risk are both high. And what that does is it creates a possibility for the policymaking process to open up to include alternative individuals, members of the public, journalists, and not-for-profit perspectives. What those uncertain narratives do is that they can create the opportunity for social learning, which can happen in more public engagement forums. In this case, regulatory frameworks have the potential to result, or regulatory change is much more likely to result in a significant paradigmatic shift. And I argue in the book that at least in theory, uncertain risk narratives can generate the potential for outsiders to gain access to the policy process, especially if there's a sufficient time for trust and social learning to occur among participants. So here's a type of uncertain risk narrative, which says there's a lack of information, there's people have legitimate concerns and questions, and there's some risks that we don't fully understand. And then finally, one of the more interesting kinds of narratives are catastrophic risk narratives. And this is when dread risks are framed as severe, but they're also certain. And so you're not concerned about the uncertainty as much as the sort of catastrophic harm. And these narratives drive governments. What they do is they provide legitimate cover for governments to act immediately and urgently to protect the public interest. And so what I suggest is that from a sort of political science view is that these catastrophic risk narratives provide space for organized interest groups to move their agenda forward. And so the venue for this type of regulatory development is still in the public eye, but it's likely to be much more adversarial. And these conditions, what they do is they prompt processes of political learning among government officials. Government officials start to become very concerned with what is politically feasible within a given area. And so for fracking, if environmental interest groups and indigenous groups are able to mobilize public attention, that can lead to regulatory responses that prioritize precaution. And so what catastrophic risk narratives do is they provide mobilized communities with moral legitimacy. They provide those communities with the opportunity to challenge existing power dynamics of policymaking and put forward alternatives to the status quo. And here's an example of a catastrophic risk narrative. Some of you are probably familiar with the documentary Gasland. This is a screenshot from that showing a resident in Dimrock, Pennsylvania, setting their tap on fire. I would argue that that's a very powerful visual catastrophic risk narrative, but here's one in words. Oppositioning to fracking gathered steam after residents complained that shale fracking had transformed their drinking water into a putrid, flammable mess. So in sum, what I'm trying to argue is that risk narratives generate political power for some sets of actors while diminishing others. And for groups who are traditionally excluded from the policymaking process, including Indigenous, gendered, and racialized community, uncertain and catastrophic narratives can really provide a wedge to break open public sphere and break open policymaking debate. And so what I do in the book is I look at case studies in BC, Alberta, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about method in the Q&A, but I use a qualitative approach of combination of document analysis, media analysis, and key informant interviews. But I want to get to the BC case to give you a sense of how these dynamics unfolded. For those of you, for many of you, this will be a sort of refresher, but hopefully will provide a little bit of an alternative gloss on how you remember events and occurring. So as you probably will remember, in 2010, the Graham government approved an exploration permit to Swin Resources, who was a subsidiary of a US shale producer that really granted access for exploration across a huge chunk of New Brunswick, a seventh of New Brunswick's landmass. And then following the PC election in early 2011, what the Alward government did was to strike an internal working group. In 2012, conducted public hearings, and in the spring of 2013, the government introduced a comprehensive framework that included 97 rules for industry. But despite this regulatory response, throughout the summer of 2013, Indigenous and environmental groups organized against seismic testing that was occurring near Elsipogtog, and Indigenous activists established a blockade throughout, which had been going on for sort of 2 years previous. And then, of course, you will definitely remember the RCMP violently dismantling the blockade in October 2013, escalating conflict and really drawing attention to unresolved treaty rights in the province. And then in 2014, following the contested election, the Gallant government introduced a moratorium on the practice, which they then renewed in 2016. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more in the QA about recent quiet moves to reopen fracking for the wells near Sussex. But for the purpose of this analysis, I focus mostly on these developments. And so what I find in the research is shifts in risk narratives. So this looks at provincial news coverage in New Brunswick, and what you see is initially kind of low levels of both dread and unknown risks. And what I argue is that this fosters a narrative of complex risk among government officials working within government. And so what they focus on is that here's just a quote that sort of demonstrates this kind of process of complex risk. The interviewee says, "It was interesting because I went from this is interesting, I understand the science to it, to seeing gasland, to thinking this is horrible, it's really going to destroy our province, to then going back and really studying it. And I remember being very much opposed, and then the scientist in me kicked in and I started looking and digging and was like, okay, no, not so bad, how do we do this right?" But despite these perceptions within government, public perception of dread risk was growing throughout this time period and really peaks in 2013 during the Elsipogtog protests. Throughout this time period, Indigenous and environmental activists, what they did is they increased issue salience by focusing on the potential for fracking to have devastating effects on groundwater and traditional ways of life within New Brunswick communities. And I really so I think that this is part of the reason why it was so successful as a campaign, is because because activists were focusing on dread risk. And this seemed to suggest that government was heading into direct conflict with the public. This is from an interview with Energy Minister Craig Leonard, who at the time. And so he said the information was so getting tainted, whether it was government saying certain things, industry saying certain things, those opposed making their points, that it got to the simple point where the average person was simply saying, I don't know who to believe anymore. So the concept was, we'll go to the one area that still has credibility in our society, which is the academics. Now, that will make all of us working in academia probably amused, But what's so fascinating about the New Brunswick case is that even despite the scandal that ended up enveloping the Energy Institute, and we can again talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A, is that Gallant, the Liberal government, when they were pushing for a moratoria, they rooted their argument not in dread risk, but in the certain risk, in scientific uncertainty. And so they tried to basically, in effect, dampen political or public outrage by focusing on scientific uncertainty. And Gallant consistently referred to studies that were going on at the time, even referring to, in the House, he read out two paragraphs of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency report to basically argue for a more precautionary approach. And just to give you a sense of that, my media analysis also confirms the degree to which this focus on scientific uncertainty serves to shift and contain public debate. And so this is, you can see broken out by actor type, but really what I want you to focus on here is the majority of references to scientific uncertainty are by elected officials in opposition, and this is primarily Gallant during the 2014 campaign. And so I think what Gallant was doing is using that scientific uncertainty to justify the moratorium, which he then put in place shortly after taking office. So in the book, what I do is I compare these dynamics between the different provinces. And I find, just to give you a little taste of those other case studies, I find in BC that there's a dominant perspective of linear risk, and that makes it very difficult for activists to shift the debate. There's a sort of, I could talk more about BC, but basically the linear risk dominates, and it never gets shifted. But in Alberta, we start to see that even though there's a linear risk, dread risk from the US and those kinds of framings really start to affect regulators' perceptions, and this results in a more precautionary or slightly more comprehensive framework. In Nova Scotia, we see a sort of uncertain, kind of a little bit different between linear and complex risk initially, and that results in sort of a de facto pause or a moratoria while they figure out what they're going to do. But again, there's an active, and I wanted to talk more about this today, but I was worried about time, so happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But in Nova Scotia, you see they dubbed themselves a League of Ladies, and it was a series of activists, grassroots activists, and women activists in environmental organizations across Nova Scotia who really started to encourage people to use science to put forward a challenging narrative, and they use both uncertain and catastrophic risk narratives in the public hearings. And what I find is that this fosters a sort of political learning among government officials in Nova Scotia, and that's how you get to the legislated ban. Okay, so what does that mean? And then there's New Brunswick that I just talked about. So what this means, what I'm hoping that my work contributes to, well, first is to look at ongoing comparative provincial scholarship on climate and energy politics. And I have some other work looking at how we perceive of loss and how the ways in which loss perception can really drive shifts in both public opinion, but also within policymaking. And moving forward, what I'd really like to do is tease out the influence of scientific uncertainty on the one hand and dread risk on the other, because there's been some initial work in the US that finds that uncertain risk can serve to put a brake on action by governments, whereas issue salience can really push governments to act. And so I'm interested in this tension between these two different kinds of frames of risk. On the theory side of things, I hope that my research contributes to theoretical work on policy learning in policy process journals. But for this audience in particular, I'm interested in working out how these uncertain and dread risks can foster different modes of policymaking within governments. And here I'm really interested in engaging with the work of a lot of environmental justice scholars. Sarah Marie Wiebe, for example, has done a lot of work in the Chemical Valley about the ways in which how we might engage and think about the ways in which dread risks are really felt physically, that they're physically embodied in our Indigenous and racialized communities, and the ways in which you might come about for a different a policymaking process that really took that knowledge seriously might be different. And that's her work on sensing policy. So I'm sort of interested in how some of the ideational findings that I have found in my research around risk construction might tie into some of those conversations. And then finally, I think my research really contributes to ongoing work in social science and technology studies on the role of scientific advice and public consultation in Canadian policymaking. And I'm really curious about what are the conditions under which governments are able to hold on to an uncertain narrative and hold space for social policy, social learning, real processes of engagement to occur. Some of the initial research suggests that this really only happens iteratively over time and under conditions of trust. And so I'm curious about if there are factors that can build that trust. Decarbonization in Canada is going to require public support, and my research suggests that governments who want to implement new technologies are really to attend to and to become much more deft in their navigation of the politics of risk. So thanks very much, and I look forward to talking with you and discussing in more detail this afternoon. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Heather. Very exciting to hear about the thing again.
Thanks.
Get an echo from you there.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. So we're going to open the floor up to questions. I'm sure I know a lot of people on the call actually participated in the some of the movements. I know I have my own questions, but does anybody have any questions, or should I start us off? Everybody's being shy, Heather. Sorry about that. So I want to ask you, just to get us started off, when I look at your axis, I'm kind of brought back to the feminine versus masculine response, and masculine being like logic and science, and feminine being like emotional and sort of reactive. And so do you find that gendered reaction to risk in your analysis of the public policy?
That's a great question, and it's really something that I am only more recently coming to. I mean, in risk perception research, they usually do find that in general people will fall in that, but I'm not so sure. I think for dread risk, definitely there is a sort of gendered component. I'm not so sure about how that might play out with regards to uncertainty. So the uncertainty axis is interesting because it's more about, is it an unknown? You know, is it, if I mean to use Rumsfeld, which is terrible, but it's more not the probability. I mean, so the reason, the way that my research differs from, for example, traditional risk assessment, which would usually just say, what's the extent of harm and what's the probability of that harm, and then kind of engage in a kind of rational calculation, you know, expected probability. And what I'm trying to say is that scientific uncertainty is really, how much do we see ourselves in a realm that has historical precedent versus something in which we have no anchor. We have no, you know, we're only working in a space of lack of evidence. And so that traditional linear model of comprehensive rational decision making is not going to work. And so then we really are in a space where we have to have a political conversation about values. So I think I would say I'm still trying to work through and to keep up on. So the thing with the risk perception research is where it's filtered into fracking research is to basically just try to explain people's priors. So explain public opinion. But I'm trying to make more of a policy process argument about what's happening within government and sort of more of a kind of discourse approach. And so I think that there is a feminized component, which is why, so there's a lived experience piece, which is that people living in communities which are disproportionately negatively affected by environmental impacts tend to be racialized, indigenous women who are paying attention to, is there in the US, women are paying attention to, is there a well that's being drilled near my school, my kid's school, right? And with the sort of related embodiedness of those effects. But I also think there's also, we know within policymaking, especially technical energy policymaking, a devaluing of anything that is not controlled linear risk area. Those questions, when people come to the table and say, hey, why are we doing this at all? I don't want to be, let's keep it in the ground, that kind of questioning of the policy goal gets diminished as a legitimate claim. And so what I'm interested in is does this combination, does scientific I know that dread risk creates a moral legitimacy for the claim, even though people will devalue dread risk. Scientific uncertainty, I'm still trying to figure out. I think that the governments can use it as a cover. It's a retreat from dread risk back. So you can reduce the power of a moral legitimacy of a dread risk narrative if you shift it to uncertainty. So that's my hunch, and that's what I'm trying to develop in the book. But I'm trying to work out some of those gendered elements as well for the framing of the book.
And it'll be interesting to see if you can apply the findings that you make to other sort of environmental issues, which that'll be really interesting. We've got 2 questions from Joan McFarland on the chat. She says she's asking what the single issue regulation is that they have in BC. If you could just quickly sum that up. And then she's also asking about the legal. She's never heard of them, so she wants a little bit more information about that, please.
Yeah, so okay, it might have just been sort of what they were informally calling themselves, but it's the League of Ladies was folks from the Sierra Club, the Ecology Action Center, and the name of the grassroots it's No Frack in Nova Scotia. Mm-hmm. I think. So that was them, and that they sort of informally, they had meetings, and so they would call themselves the League of Ladies as the meetings, in terms of getting information out to people to come out to those public hearings in Nova Scotia that were headed up by David Wheeler. Mm-hmm. In BC, they basically just focused on chemical disclosure. So they created in the US, the Groundwater Protection Council works with the industry regulators to put out frac focus. There's been a lot of critique of frac focus because it basically doesn't have a lot of information on it. But in BC, basically, that's what they did. They said that people had to disclose what chemicals they were using, but it's still it's still a reactive kind of regulation, because it's not saying that they have to reduce their contaminants. It's just saying they have to say if they've contaminated, and it still is on the public to then go and find find the instance and then draw attention to it. So that's basically, they also have what's called area-based analysis, which is pretty limited. It kind of comes into their land use planning. But it's all in BC. Regulations are put forward by the BC Oil and Gas Commission. So it's arm's length from government. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's definitely different from here. We have a question also from Rachel de Molitor. This was an incredible talk. Thank you so much, Heather. I was just wondering if you could talk more about your methodology. Have you noticed a plurality of narratives that individuals or organizations are employing? Anything you'd like to share would be interesting. And Rachel's also asking if the talk will be available. And I did not manage to record Lisa's fabulous talk last week, which I'm very sad about, and I do apologize for, Lisa. But I am taping this one, so hopefully we'll be able to make the recording available. So over to you, Heather.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, so much for asking about method. I didn't want to bore people, but basically I'm using process tracing. So basically trying to set out the historical record of events and being close attention to sequencing. But a lot of my research came from, I looked at, I think it's about 400 articles in the Times transcript. And what I did was code for these different, I sort of developed inductively, coded different snippets into these different narratives and then built them up into uncertain and dread risk. And I used in vivo for that. With regards to, and basically it's two paired comparisons. So I'm looking at Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and then looking at Alberta and BC, and then trying to draw some broad comparisons or conclusions from the Western Atlantic Canada comparison, but more on a, not a sort of, basically to try to control for some of the institutional and material differences in just resource through both. I hope that answers the method question. I think you'd asked about like what messages different individuals or groups have used. Definitely one of the more interesting elements is the way in which talking about, so two things. One is the way that very early on industry tried to promote fracking is safe. We've been doing it for 50 years. And you just heard that over and over and over again in debate, along with, oh, people are just misinformed. So, which is a really common, it's discouraging for people who've done SDS who are like, no, more information is not, going to get you what you want. But it is surprising in interviews how many government officials told me that people were just misinformed. But the other piece is to watch how the shift of concern about risks. Basically, I was doing this research, the chunk of the research, when there was very little information out. Now we have much more scientific consensus on some of the risks. And interestingly, now I think some of the bigger groundwater has receded a little bit as a concern, but seismic activity has definitely begun to peak, as well as concerns about methane emissions, which have significant problems for climate. The degree of the potential for just some of these wells to result in sort of really high levels of methane is a problem. I hope that answers. Please let me know if it hasn't. Talk about more.
Rachel, let us know if she didn't answer your question. Is there any other questions? Heather, I'm wondering, do you think there was a shift when the academic institute that had been like promoting all of the fracking, which was seen as, which the government had sort of backed and had this arm's length relationship with, but all of a sudden was completely discredited, and so that the authority, right, that academic authority, all of a sudden was gone, and there was no real place to go from there.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it was interesting. I talked to David Allward and I was like, yeah, so how did you feel about the Energy Institute? And He was like, yeah, it didn't help. Which I think was the understatement of the year. I think that what's interesting about, I mean, beyond the sort of sui generis, like who could have predicted that Lapierre's credentials would have, but I think what was interesting was it shows you the attempt to shift the narrative into even further into that complex risk sphere where you can just say, well, science will just solve the problem for us. And I think this is a very common blame avoidance move that you see politically, that politicians to avoid blame, is to shift it into science. And there's some great work by the Roger Pilka in a book called The Honest Broker, which really talks about it never works. I mean, you can't have if the debate is about values. I mean, if the debate is core values about who we are as society and what energy resources we want to develop and what kind of protections we want to have, turning to science is not going to help. And so what you see in these kinds of debates is science starts to get used more and more instrumentally. And also that you start to see attacks on the credibility of scientists. And we see this a lot in climate change debate in the US, for example, is where you start to see, even in Nova Scotia, you saw the tail end attacks on David Wheeler's credibility. And so I think it's this twin dynamics of politicians wanting to depoliticize an issue by turning to science, and really what it does is it just politicizes science.
Yeah, it's definitely fascinating. And I'm thinking, yeah, of course, you referenced COVID at the beginning of your talk, and how our chief medical officers, who are mostly women in Canada, have been put at the forefront of the issue and touted as the authorities to follow. And there's kind of been that kind of switch there, because usually the scientific authorities are always kind of figured as masculine. So it's fascinating. I know we could probably keep talking about this for a while. We're going to close up. I just want to let you know that we'll be taking up the Feminist Lunch series again in the winter 2021 term. The talks are sponsored by the Dean of Arts Office at UNB, the UNB Gender and Women's Studies program, and the UNB Stu University Women's Center. And we're very thankful to Daniel Grant, who's been helping us with the technological parts of these virtual talks. Thank you so much, Heather, for a fascinating talk, and thank you everybody for attending, and I hope you have a great day today. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.